There is a city in southern Turkey called Antakya that sits on the same ground where one of the most psychologically extreme episodes in the entire history of medieval warfare played out across 9 months in 1097 and 1098. And if you walk its narrow streets today in the shadow of the mountain that looms over the Orontes River Valley, you're walking through the footprint of a siege so savage and so prolonged and so completely inverting of every military expectation that the men who survived it spent the rest of their lives trying to find language adequate to what they had endured. Because Antioch, in the winter of 1097 to 1098, was not a siege in the conventional sense of a superior force methodically reducing an inferior one. It was something closer to a mutual consumption. The Crusader army outside the walls, starving in the rain and the cold, while the garrison inside held walls so vast and so formidable that the entire Crusader force could not encircle them completely, supply columns being ambushed, horses dying faster than they could be replaced, men eating their own leather equipment. And the question that the mountain above Antakya is still asking across 9 centuries is not merely how the Crusaders took Antioch and then held it against a relief army that should have destroyed them utterly. The question is what human beings are capable of when the only alternative to the impossible is death, and whether what they did to survive deserves the name of miracle or the name of something considerably darker. The Crusader army that arrived at Antioch in October 1097 was already a diminished and fractured version of the force that had left Constantinople months earlier. Disease and desertion and the brutal crossing of Anatolia had stripped tens of thousands from a host that had never been the unified Christian army of the mythology, but a coalition of competing Norman and French and Provençal and Lotharingian contingents whose leaders, Bohemond of Taranto and Raymond of Toulouse and Godfrey of Bouillon and the others, disagreed about strategy and precedence and ultimate objective with an intensity that the common enterprise of survival only partially suppressed. And Antioch itself presented a military problem of genuine enormity because its walls ran for 12 miles across the slopes of Mount Silpius, incorporating the mountain itself as a defensive feature. Walls studded with 400 towers garrisoned by a Seljuk commander named Yaghi-Siyan, who understood perfectly well that he needed only to hold until a relief army arrived. And the Crusaders lacked the manpower to encircle the city completely, which meant that supplies and reinforcements continued reaching the garrison through the gaps in the siege lines, while the besiegers themselves were being slowly killed by hunger and the disease that follows hunger with the mechanical reliability of a shadow. And into this deteriorating situation, Bohemond of Taranto, the Norman prince from southern Italy, whose political intelligence was as formidable as his military capability, and whose personal ambition was the organizing principle of every decision he made, began conducting a private negotiation that he kept secret from his fellow leaders for months. Bohemond had made contact with an Armenian convert to Islam serving as a tower commander named Firouz, and what passed between them in whispered messages across the walls of Antioch was a transaction whose precise terms the sources debate, but whose outcome is not debatable. On the night of June 2nd, 1098, Bohemond's men climbed into the tower Firouz commanded and opened the gates, and the Crusader army poured into Antioch. And the city fell in hours with a massacre of the garrison and much of the population that the Crusader chroniclers record with the same casualness they bring to recording the weather. And then, 3 days later, while the Crusaders were still consolidating their hold on the city and before they had secured the citadel on the mountain above which remained in Muslim hands, the relief army they had been dreading for months arrived. The force of Kerbogha, the Atabeg of Mosul, who had assembled a coalition of Muslim rulers, estimated in the sources at numbers, certainly exaggerated but representing a genuine military mass, that the exhausted and still starving Crusaders could not hope to match in open battle, and the siege inverted. The besiegers became the besieged, trapped inside the city they had just taken, eating their horses and their dogs and the leather of their harnesses. And this is the moment where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary. The uncomfortable truth embedded in the Crusaders' survival at Antioch is that the event which turned the psychological tide, the discovery of the Holy Lance, the relic supposedly buried beneath the floor of a church inside the city, identified in a vision by a Provençal peasant named Peter Bartholomew, was almost certainly a fabrication, and not an innocent one, because the lance appeared at the precise moment when the army's morale had collapsed, to the point where rational military analysis offered no basis for continued resistance, and the ecclesiastical establishment accompanying the army was deeply divided about its authenticity. The papal legate Adhemar of Le Puy was openly skeptical, and Peter Bartholomew's subsequent death by ordeal, burned while carrying the lance to prove its authenticity, though he survived the fire for several days before succumbing to his injuries, does not resolve the question of what was actually found under that church floor. And Bohemond's role in the lance's sudden appearance at the critical moment of psychological collapse has never been definitively established and has never been definitively excluded. And the sally that the Crusaders launched against Kerbogha's army on June 28, 1098, the starving men pouring out of Antioch's gates in a desperation that their enemies interpret as either madness or divine inspiration, succeeded not because God intervened, but because Kerbogha's coalition, assembled from competing political interests, fractured under the pressure of the unexpected assault and the political calculation that the cost of holding together exceeded the cost of withdrawing. Antioch, after its capture, became not the shared resource of the crusading enterprise, but the personal possession of Bohemond of Taranto, who had orchestrated the betrayal, and who simply refused to relinquish it to Byzantine imperial authority as the Crusader leaders had sworn to do, founding the Principality of Antioch as his own dynastic holding. And this seizure, this conversion of a sacred military enterprise into a private territorial acquisition, is the moment that the political reality underneath the crusading ideology becomes fully visible, and the crusade continued to Jerusalem without Bohemond, took the city in July 1099 with the massacre already examined in this series, and the Crusader states that resulted were from their first day, as much the private real estate ventures of their Norman and French founders. As they were the outposts of Christian civilization that the mythology required them to be, and Antioch itself was held by Crusader successors until 1268, when the Mamluk Sultan Baybars took it and reportedly killed or enslaved its entire population in an act of deliberate reciprocal violence whose scale matched anything the Crusaders had done in 1098, and the city never recovered its ancient prominence. And today, Antakya is a provincial Turkish city, still carrying in its geological memory the weight of what was done in its streets, by men who believed they were doing God's work, and the question those streets are still asking, that the mountain above the Orontes is still asking, is the question that every act of collective violence justified by sacred necessity eventually leaves vibrating in the stones it passes through, which is this: when the miracle that saves you requires you to become the thing you came to destroy, and at what point does the salvation become indistinguishable from the catastrophe, and who gets to decide? And does it matter that the answer depends entirely on which side of the wall you were standing on when the gates opened?